He was never supposed to be found. For 137 years, the most feared name in criminal history belonged to nobody.
No arrest.
No trial. No face. Just 5 dead women, a city gripped by terror, and a killer who walked out of the fog and back into it, leaving nothing behind but a legend. Until now. Because 2 scientists say they finally pulled a name out of a bloodstain that sat forgotten in a drawer for over a century. And the man they found was not who anyone expected. Before we get to the DNA, you need to understand why this case became the most famous unsolved murder mystery on Earth. In the autumn of 1888, London's East End was one of the most overcrowded, impoverished districts in the world. Hundreds of thousands of people were packed into a few square miles of narrow streets, cramped lodging houses, and blind alleys that even the police struggled to navigate. Coal smoke mixed with fog to create what Londoners called a pea souper, a yellow haze so thick a person could vanish 3 feet away. It was into this world that a killer emerged, murdering at least 5 women in a matter of weeks, each attack more brutal than the last. The press seized on the story, and a killer who signed haunting letters to newspapers as Jack the Ripper became an instant sensation. But Scotland Yard, for all its effort, had almost nothing to work with. There was no fingerprinting, no forensic laboratories, no way to test blood beyond confirming it was human. Detectives had a whistle, a wooden truncheon, and their own eyes, against a killer who moved through the fog like smoke. With no answer, the public did what people always do when a horror defies explanation. They built a myth. Because if the killer was just an ordinary man from an ordinary street, the horror felt meaningless. So theories multiplied. Maybe he was a brilliant surgeon, given how precisely he had mutilated his victims. Maybe he was an aristocrat slumming through the slums for sport. One of the most persistent theories claimed the murders were tied to the royal family itself, that a secret pregnancy involving Queen Victoria's grandson had to be covered up, and that the victims were silenced one by one to protect the crown. It was a sensational story, and it was almost certainly fiction. But it revealed exactly what people wanted the Ripper to be: powerful, mysterious, extraordinary. Anything but ordinary. Decade after decade, new books appeared, each with a new confident suspect. A doctor, a painter, a prince, a poet. And each time, the case slipped back into mystery because there was never any hard evidence to settle it. The file stayed open. The legend grew. And somewhere along the way, solving the case almost stopped mattering because the not knowing had become part of the story's power. But mysteries built on missing evidence can crack open the moment evidence appears. And in this case, the evidence had been sitting in plain sight the entire time, dismissed by nearly everyone who ever laid eyes on it, an old, stained, unremarkable piece of silk. The object at the center of this story is a shawl, faded and marked with dark, old stains that most people would have thrown away without a second thought. According to a story passed down for generations, this shawl was found at the scene of the 4th murder, beside the body of a woman named Catherine Eddowes, on the night of September 30th, 1888. The account claims a police officer at the scene took the shawl home rather than logging it as evidence, an act that would be unthinkable by modern standards, but was not unusual in an era before formal evidence procedures existed. The shawl stayed in that officer's family for generations, folded away as an odd heirloom nobody quite wanted to keep and nobody quite dared to discard. For most historians, that missing paper trail was disqualifying. An object with no official record, no chain of custody, and only a family story to vouch for it fit a familiar pattern in Ripper research, a relic that could never be verified, one of many objects claimed over the decades to be connected to the murders, almost all of which turned out to be fabrications or wishful thinking. So the shawl sat, largely dismissed, until 2007, when it came up for auction and was purchased by an author and self-described amateur investigator named Russell Edwards. Edwards had spent years absorbed in the case, and he believed the shawl was genuine. He also understood something the original Victorian detectives never could have imagined, that modern science might be able to make the object speak. Edwards partnered with a molecular biologist, Dr. Jari Luhalainen of Liverpool John Moores University, a researcher who specialized in an extremely difficult task, recovering usable genetic material from samples that are old, degraded, and by ordinary standards, dead. That specialty mattered enormously here, because the shawl was over 125 years old and had spent that time not in a climate-controlled vault, but folded in drawers, handled by relatives, exposed to light, moisture, and decades of human contact. Every one of those years worked against the survival of any genetic evidence. By most reasonable expectations, recovering a usable DNA profile from this object should have been close to impossible. The research team's approach was to focus not on the fibers of the shawl itself, but on the old, dark stains soaked into the material, since biological residue can sometimes protect genetic material far longer than exposed fabric can. And rather than search for standard nuclear DNA, the kind found in the nucleus of a cell that is relatively scarce and quick to break down, they searched for mitochondrial DNA, a different and far more abundant type of genetic material. Every cell contains hundreds or thousands of mitochondria, each carrying its own small loop of DNA separate from the DNA in the nucleus, which makes mitochondrial DNA dramatically more likely to survive in a badly degraded sample. Mitochondrial DNA has another property that made it essential to this investigation. It is passed down only through the maternal line, from mother to child, generation after generation, largely unchanged. A man carries his mother's mitochondrial DNA but does not pass it to his own children. That means a mitochondrial signature preserved today can, in principle, be compared against a person who lived over a century ago, as long as an unbroken maternal line connects them. In a case this cold, that stability was the only realistic bridge across 137 years. To test whether the shawl was authentic, the researchers first needed a genetic reference point tied to a known victim. They traced Catherine et al.'s family tree through parish records, census documents, and certificates of birth, marriage, and death, following the maternal line down through generations until they located a living descendant of et al.'s sister. A simple cheek swab from that descendant gave them a mitochondrial profile to compare against material recovered from the bloodstains on the shawl. According to the published findings, the two profiles matched, not as a loose or partial similarity, but as a clear match consistent with maternal descent. If the result holds up, it would mean the shawl was very likely present at the crime scene, that it had contact with Catherine et al.'s blood, and that the century of dismissal as a worthless keepsake had been wrong all along. That alone would have been a significant historical finding. But the researchers reported something else on the shawl, a second biological trace, distinct from the victim's blood, which they identified as consistent with semen. If genuine, this second trace would not belong to the victim at all. It would belong to whoever attacked her. The team extracted mitochondrial DNA from this second stain and set out to find someone to compare it against, not a random guess pulled from the long list of Ripper theories, but a name that had already appeared in the original 1888 police files. Because, contrary to how the case is often remembered, the Victorian detectives were not simply chasing rumors. Away from the newspapers, they had compiled their own private list of serious suspects. One name near the top of that list belonged to a man almost nobody outside of serious Ripper research had ever heard of, Aaron Kosminski. Researchers traced Kosminski's family tree the same way they had traced et al.'s, following the maternal line to a living descendant, who agreed to provide a sample. When that mitochondrial profile was compared against the genetic material recovered from the second stain on the shawl, the team reported a match. If Kosminski's name means little to most people, that is precisely what makes this claim so different from everything that came before it. He was not a duke, a surgeon, or a criminal mastermind. He was a 23-year-old Polish-Jewish immigrant working as a barber in the East End, a man who had fled violent anti-Jewish persecution in the Russian Empire only to end up in poverty in London. By the accounts of the police officers who investigated him at the time, Kosminski showed signs of severe mental illness, what modern specialists have suggested may have resembled paranoid schizophrenia, along with what the officers themselves described as a hatred toward women. This isn't a modern narrative dressed up for effect. These are characterizations recorded by the investigators who actually knew him. Two pieces of historical documentation support how seriously police once regarded him. In an internal 1894 memorandum, senior police official Melville Macnaghten listed Kosminski among the strongest suspects in the case. And Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, the officer who had overseen the entire Ripper investigation, later wrote a private note in the margin of his own copy of a colleague's memoir, identifying Kosminski by name as the man he believed was responsible, stating that the suspect had been confined to an asylum and died there. That note was never intended for public release. It surfaced only when Swanson's descendants found it decades later. The timeline adds another layer. Kosminski lived in the same crowded district where the murders occurred. He was known to police as dangerous. In 1891, his family had him committed to an asylum, unable to manage or protect him any longer. And notably, the murders that had terrorized London stopped once he was removed from the streets. None of this, however, makes the case closed. The 2019 publication of these findings in the journal Forensic Science International Genetics was met with serious scientific pushback, and it's important to be upfront about that criticism rather than presenting the DNA match as the final word. The central concern is contamination. This shawl passed through the hands of a police officer, then his family for generations, then collectors, then an auction house, then Russell Edwards, and finally a modern laboratory over more than a century of handling. Multiple geneticists have pointed out that the study did not fully rule out the possibility that the DNA came from someone who touched the shawl at some point in the last 100 years, rather than from the crime itself. Critics have also raised questions about the specific mitochondrial sequence used, noting that it is common enough that a match doesn't narrow things down as precisely as a full match would, and some researchers have said the study's methods and data were not published in enough detail to be independently verified. In other words, this is a genuinely disputed claim, not a settled scientific fact, and responsible retellings of this case need to say so clearly. So where does that leave us? The historical record shows that Victorian police investigators seriously suspected Aaron Kosminski, documented it in writing at the time, and continued to believe it privately for the rest of their lives. Modern genetic research has offered a possible scientific link between Kosminski and the crime scene, though that research has faced real and unresolved criticism from other scientists over contamination and methodology. Both things can be true at once. The case may be closer to an answer than it has ever been, while still not being definitively closed. What do you think? Does the historical suspicion combined with this genetic research finally point to the truth, or is more than a century of handling enough to make any DNA match unreliable? Let me know what you think in the comments.